After that long introduction to the prophetic background and the prophetic movement and how the prophecies were collected, edited, and came to us the present form, we begin in the 8th century with prophet Amos, who seems to be, or the book of Amos seems to be the oldest book, oldest prophetic book. So it's important for us to make the most out of this study that you should have a Bible open before you and possibly a physical Bible than a digital electronic version for obvious reasons, because we'll have to leaf through the pages and it will be easier for us, and probably to put your thumb on some page or bookmark or something like that. So I recommend that you have the English Standard Version of the Bible and the book of Amos open before you. Verse 1 begins, that is the title, which is from the editor of these oracles of Amos. Whoever collected the oracles and whoever structured them in this form, in this order, we don't know. They haven't given us their names or any details about them. But chapter 1, verse 1, it's the basic title given to this book or collection of the oracles and the life of prophet Amos. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. His place is given. He came from a village called Tekoa, which we know now that it is about 15 miles south of Bethlehem. That means, if you know a little bit of the geography of Israel, of that land, Canaan, you know that it is the southernmost tip of Judah. So we saw that the kingdom is now divided into two: the northern kingdom with the 12 tribes, and then the southern kingdom with the 2 tribes, and Bethlehem in Judah, and the southern part of Bethlehem is the south of Bethlehem is small town called Tekoa. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that maybe during this time, that is 8th century, early 8th century period, Tekoa probably was a small village, had almost 150 people, that's all, a very small village of 150 people. And the editor says here that he was one of the shepherds of Tekoa. Tekoa seems to be the village of people, pastoral farmland holders, or people who are engaged in sheep breeding. So he was one of them. But in 714, that is chapter 7 verse 14, there we will come to that later, but there in his confrontation with priest Amaziah, he says, the prophet himself says that I was no prophet nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. So here he clarifies that he was a sheep breeder, he was a shepherd. Probably doesn't simply mean that man a laborer who went followed the sheep all over, but probably he had a business. He was a large owner of many flocks, and he also was engaged in dressing the sycamore trees. So the date, it says, the date is the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And this is around, King Uzziah was king from 783 to 742 BC. King Jeroboam ruled northern Israel, while Uzziah reigned over the southern kingdom. Jeroboam II reigned from 786 to 746. And in the previous classes we saw that the first half of the 8th century were the days of tremendous prosperity and peace for both kingdoms. Moreover, to add to the prosperity, now the neighboring countries were weak. Assyria was not a dominant power. Egypt was also not a dominant power those days. So they had space to expand and prosper. They had control over the trade routes, access to the port in Red Sea, that is Esiyon Geba, and we saw all that backgrounds last week. So, since it is a period when these two the rule of these two kings overlapped, we can say that Amos ministered somewhere between 767 to 753. Furthermore, the title says that king who 2 years before the earthquake. Now, when did this earthquake take place in the 8th century? We know that earthquakes doesn't happen every year. It's not a ordinary regular phenomena. It happens once in a blue moon. And so earthquakes are good markers of time. So we don't know exactly. But we are sure that in the 8th century there was an earthquake. Discoveries, archaeological excavations in a place called Hazor has shown that during the early part of the 8th century there was an earthquake in Canaan. And we cannot date that earthquake exactly, but some people have gone ahead and dated it around 760 BC. If that dating is correct, then he started his ministry in 762 BC, 2 years before the earthquake. So, but why the title mentions the earthquake? Now, is it? He could have said it another way. If he wanted to give us a date, he could have said in the 13th year of Jeroboam, or he could have said or in the 10th year, a time reference to any of the rulers of whom he mentioned. But instead of making a reference to the rulers, which is more or less precisely we can fix, why an earthquake is referenced. Now, the purpose of this could be a validation of Amos's prophecies. Even before introducing Amos's prophecies, the title, whoever wrote the title, tells us that he is a true prophet. An earthquake happened before 2 years after. So, if it is 2 years after, it is no BC we count down, isn't it? So, 2 years before the earthquake, Amos had started his ministry or did his prophecies. Another important thing is that we don't know how many years that Amos prophesied. Probably it could be that just probably a week or even a day. He's not like Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel, where we have other time references where we can say that Isaiah, for example, not exactly, ministered for 40 years from the year of death, the death of Uzziah, to the early days of Manasseh. We have no such references. So, the reference to the earthquake is another way of saying that Amos prophesied. Whatever Amos prophesied, at least the earthquake did happen as he prophesied. There are a number of references in the book of Amos to an earthquake that he prophesied before it ever happened. So I was saying that Amos's ministry, we don't know the duration of his ministry, how many years of his ministry. And whatever he said, probably he could have said within a day or a week or a month. It need not, it doesn't have to be for a longer period of a lifetime or something like that. In the book of Amos, in chapter 8, verse 8, Amos makes a reference, or Amos prophesies that as a punishment, as a judgment, God is going to send an earthquake. Let me read that passage to you. Amos chapter 8 verse 8. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about and sink again like the Nile of Egypt. So he is actually prophesying about an earthquake where the land, the ground will rise like the tide in the Nile's river, and will also go down suddenly as the low tide, the water level in the Nile, river Nile. And he is talking about a trembling of the land. The land will tremble. There will be some seismic disaster is going to happen. An earthquake is going to happen. He prophesied that, and also in verses 1, chapter 9, verse 1, he says, I saw the Lord standing beside the altar and said, strike the capitals until the thresholds shake, and shatter them on the heads of all people. And those who are left of them I will kill with the sword, and none of them shall flee away, not one of them shall escape. And in verse 5 he says, the Lord of hosts, chapter 9 verse 5, he who touches the earth and it melts, and all who dwell in it mourn, and all that rises like Nile, the previous imagery, and sings again, goes up and down like the Nile of Egypt. Now, this means that Amos told the people of northern Israel, that is where he ministered. Okay, if I left out to mention it, he was a prophet to the northern Israel. He was a southerner. He was from Judah, and he was from the kingdom of Judah in the south, but God called him to go all the way to north, to Bethel, the sanctuary at Bethel, where he prophesied these prophecies. So, why the mention about the earthquake? The earthquake is not exactly for the purpose of dating the prophecies of Amos, but it's a way of saying that whatever this prophet prophesied did happen. An earthquake happened 2 years after he prophesied about an earthquake that God is going to send as judgment upon Israel, upon the whole land. Now, we move on from there to verse 2. In verse 2, we have an intro to the entire book of Amos. Here is in verse 2, after the title, identifying the prophet, his time, and his profession, and the place from where he came. It's important. The place is important. Why? Because the ministry was in the north, in Bethel, in another kingdom. So it's important to say that he was not of that country, but he was from another country, that is the southern country, all the way from deep south in Tekoa. Now, here we have in verse 2, whatever it's called probably in orchestra music, we call it, we can use that same time, overture, which is an introduction to the entire composition, the presentation, the symphony or the orchestra that is going to happen now. There's an introduction to the whole thing. It actually brings the theme, the whole theme. What is that? Verse 2. And he said, so this man from Tekoa, before 2 years before the earthquake, he said, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. Now, that's how he introduces his prophecies. What is that? He calls his prophecy the roar of a lion from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital, or is the dwelling place of Yahweh, the God of the 12 tribes. He has made Jerusalem his dwelling place on earth. It's true that Jeroboam built 2 shrines, one in Bethel and one in Dan, so that people will not go after the division of the kingdom. The people will not go down to the Jerusalem to worship, because if they go down for the festivals and worship, then they may develop sympathies, loyalties to the southern kingdoms, and his kingdom, which is built a rival kingdom in the north, may disintegrate. But now Amos is very clear. He says, now you might have built rival shrines in Dan and Beersheba, Bethel, and not Beersheba, Bethel and Dan, or Dan and Bethel, north and south. And you have installed 2 golden calves, saying these represent Yahweh. And you might have elaborate rituals there, but you have golden calves here. But that doesn't mean that God of Israel, God of the 12 tribes, have moved from Jerusalem to your shrines. God is still there. That is his house. That is where his throne on earth is. And now he is roaring from far south, Jerusalem. And what will happen? The northern part, Carmel, the mountain ranges of Carmel. And you may remember that in the book of Kings, it is on the Mount Carmel that Elijah challenged and even annihilated the prophets of Baal and re-established Yahwistic worship. But Mount Carmel on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea was a very rich with fauna and the trees and the birds and the wild animals. It was a green hill, let me put it that way. It was a very lush green hill. But Amos says now it is in Israel. It is in northern Israel. Amos says now, see, the roar of the lion, that is Yahweh, from Jerusalem has reached all the way up north, swept diagonally across the land, so that Carmel, Mount Carmel, with its rich flora and fauna, has withered, dried up. So he seems to be using an imagery, if I may, from the Chinese stories of a puffing dragon. A dragon who puffs fire, very hot air, the roar of the Lion of Judah. It's like that. And drought, dryness, is a curse. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 23 to 24, it is one of the curses for disobedience. in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27 and 28. In those chapters, chapters in Deuteronomy are the curses and blessings upon people who obey or disobey the law that God has given through Moses. Now, the Lion of Judah has roared, made his roar heard. And because of that, there is dryness, there is drought, the vegetation has died all across Israel. It is not only that. It is not only that now Amos is trying to say that I have heard him roar. And that roar of God of Israel, the 12 tribes of God who redeemed them from Egyptian slavery and brought them to this land, has not only brought out a dryness, the death of the vegetation in the land, a drought in the land, but also has compelled me to take up this prophetic role. I have heard. In chapter 3, verse 8, he repeats this same metaphor of a roaring lion, but in slightly different manner. The consequence of the roar of the lion is slightly different. In chapter 3, verse 8, he says, the lion has roared, who will not fear? When the lion roars, the small animals, the prey, though they are in the security of their hideouts, in the caves, they begin to panic and they come out. They start running, so that the lion forces them out of their caves or their dens or from their bushes, so that he can chase them and kill them. The same idea will come later. Okay, the same metaphor. The book of Amos is famous for its rich allegories, rich metaphors. He's an expert in drawing word pictures, very rich, colorful pictures. Now let's come back to this. So then what? So similarly, just as people or animals are scared when they hear the roar of the lion and they begin to panic, similarly, though not exactly, the Lord has spoken, who cannot but prophesy. That means what he is trying to say is that this is the roar of a lion. A roar of a lion has very drastic consequences on whoever hears the roar of the lion. First, it's scary. It frightens. Secondly, he says, when a person hears the roaring of the Lion of Judah, he cannot help prophesying. So what he's trying to say here is, it is not only an introduction to the entire prophecy or the book, the remaining 9 chapters, but it also talks about the reason why a shepherd of rather obscure village called Tekoa, of just 150 people, maybe just one family, why an insignificant shepherd or a dresser of the sycamore trees, which is a seasonal job, only when there is blossoms and fruits on the sycamore once in a year, he gets a job. But probably he had a sycamore estate. Whichever way, whether he is rich or poor, he had a job. Why that man should leave that job and his country and cross the borders all the way to Bethel? Because upon him was a compulsion, a prophetic compulsion. And he, in his confrontation with the priest Amaziah, we will come to that in later studies, he says, see, I am not a prophet, 7:15, He says, I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, which means I am not a professional prophet. I am not prophesying for a wage, for a fee. I'm not that type of a man. I have a job. I am a shepherd. I'm a sycamore dresser. I'm not a jobless guy who took up this job of preaching things that you don't want to hear. But I have heard the lion roar. So he says, the Lord took me, 7:15, chapter 7, verse 15 says, but the Lord took me, which means against my desire. He just took me and from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel. Now therefore, hear the word of the Lord. Now, what he says is that against my will, I never thought about this job. I never thought about this ministry. But the Lord took me from following the sheep one day, like he took Elisha when he was plowing the field. Elijah comes on the way, comes along and says, come. And he goes. Or like Ezekiel, when he was desilting the irrigation canals in Babylon, when he was at a particular canal called Kebar, the Lord takes him. Or the way Jeremiah was called to ministry, though he hesitated, he rejected that call, he had all sort of excuses against that, probably at age 23, a young man, but remained unmarried for the rest of his career. Here is Amos also endorses the same prophetic compulsion. A prophetic work is not done. You don't actually volunteer to do ministry. It is God conscripts you. God enrolls you. In the New Testament also we can see the same compulsion. Jesus just called Peter. He didn't he didn't explain to him the whole plan. We are going to form a trust, and then we are going to have a church, then we are going to have this thing, we are going to reach out, nothing like that. Just 2 words. Follow me. That's it. But did Peter ever thought that he will be there on that seashore when the carpenter of Nazareth passes by, and the carpenter of Nazareth would call him? Did Peter ever imagine that to happen? Probably not, but it happened. Against his plans, against his will, against his choice, Amos says, I am taken and flung into this task which you think is distasteful, unacceptable. So that is the introduction to the entire book. In verse 1, if I recap, in verse 1 we have the place, the person, the date of the prophet. But not only that, we have also, the editor drops clues that this man prophesied 2 years before the earthquake, which means whatever he prophesied about the earthquake did happen. And then he says that why Amos is prophesying? Because the Lion of Judah has roared. He heard the roar of the lion, and he cannot keep himself away from echoing that roar of the lion in the sanctuary, in the rival sanctuary of the idolatrous sanctuary of Bethel, and address the people of Samaria, the capital city. So here we have that, and then the prophecy, the rest of the prophecy. We are going to look at the rest of the prophecy with this basic introduction. Now, from the next verse onwards till the end of chapter 6, we have a series of prophecies of judgment. It's a huge, large section, chapter 1, verse 3 to the end of chapter 6. So that is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 chapters. But we will divide that into two again, and we will divide it further as well in order to handle it properly. Chapter 1, verse 3 up to 2:16, we have there 8 prophecies of judgment against the nations. And these 8 nations include the kingdom, the nation called Judah, and finally Israel. So that is what we see in chapter 1, 2 to 16. And after that, chapter 3 onwards, till the end of chapter 6, we have a detailed prophecy against the northern Israel. So let's just go through that quickly. I'm not going to go verse by verse at all. It's not possible. It's not possible, and I am pretty sure that I will not be able to complete the book of Amos today. But even if I have some series, a few 1 or 2 sessions more, I am pretty sure I will not be able to discuss everything one by one. But I can only give you some broad brush sketches, so that, or in some outline which you can fill in. That it will make sense when you read the book of Amos again. It will make sense to you. So let's come back to the first part, that is chapter 1 verse 3 to chapter 2 verse 16. I already mentioned that where we see 8 prophecies against 8 nations, which includes Israel. So 7 plus 1. It's against the enemies of Israel. He begins with the enemies of Israel, starting with Damascus. Damascus is a northern country, enemy number 1 of Israel always, especially in the 8th century. Then he goes all the way to Philistia, the city of Gaza, the city-state of Gaza, which is a Philistine city, in chapter 1 verses 6 onwards. Then he talks about Tyre, which is again in the northwestern side. Then far south is Edom, verses 1, 11 to 12. That is why I said you need a Bible, a physical Bible, a hard copy, so that you can flip through the pages. And then he talks about Ammon in chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. Then Moab, which is on the western side, chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. And then comes down to Judah, the southern country. But he just overlooks Israel at the moment. The next, logically, it should be Israel, because it's the northern kingdom. But he jumps to southern kingdom, Judah. So he starts from distant countries to the nearer countries in a very systematic way. He moves from west to the east in a very systematic way. It's a sort of zeroing down. So there is 2-3 things that we should note here. See, in all these, there is a particular style in which these prophecies are mentioned. See, for example, I will read chapter 1 verse 6. It is repeated in all the prophecies, okay? In all the oracles, all the 8 oracles, this structure comes. For 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. So here he says 3 transgressions of, and the city name. You can substitute the city name there, whatever you want. Moab, Ammon, Judah, and all that. And 4, I will not revoke the punishment. Then he talks about 1 or 2 sins that nation committed. And a pronouncement of judgment. Though he said 3 or 4, in none of the 7, the first 7 oracles against the individual nations, he mentions 3, doesn't mention more than 2. In the 7 cases, the first 7 cases, he will only mention 1 or 2 and moves on to the pronouncement of judgment. Why? That's the first question we need to ask. The style is same. Then, but there are 7 nations that he mentions. And then, so 7 is a complete number. 7 is a complete number. Why he should add an 8th nation? All over the Bible, number 7, number 12, number 40 are considered to be some symbolic value. So the hearers, the hearers of Amos's prophecy, when he starts with Damascus all the way to Edom and to Judah, people might have thought that, now there are 7 nations, he is going to close here with the 7th nation. But against their expectation, he goes on to add the 8th nation. And that happens to be Israel, the very northern Israel, the very people whom he is addressing. It's a rhetorical strategy to get the attention of the people, and so they will cheer up because their enemies are going to be judged. And finally he says that you are also included in the list of the enemies of God. That's his strategy. Now, why he is not mentioning when he says 3 or 4 transgressions, but he only mentions 1 or 2, and why he is hurrying? Why he is not listing all the 4 or 3 at least? Because it seems that he is hurrying towards a target, a point, a particular point. And then when he comes to the last prophecy, last oracle against the nation, and that is Judah, and then he comes to Israel in the last part, punishment of Judah, and verses 2:6 onwards, chapter 2 verse 6 onwards. There he mentions all the 4, the same formula. So let me see that. And 3 transgressions of Israel, or 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, those who trample the head of the poor. And if you count, you can see that he is giving a complete list of 4 sins. Now, that is his clever way of presentation. See, it is in a indirect way of saying that, other nations have sinned. And I can say that 1 or 2 cases of their transgressions, but you have sinned more than the other nations. Then in the following chapters, he is talking about the sins of these people, of northern Israel. There's another strategy too. The people really enjoyed this. They might have really liked Amos's preaching. It starts with Damascus. Yes, Damascus is, as I said, the arch enemy. Then it goes to Gaza. You know how many centuries of enmity between the Philistines in Gaza? If you have read the books of Samuel and Judges and Samuel, and even in the book of Kings, during the days of Samuel, even in the United Kingdom, just before the United Kingdom. So they are also arch enemies of Israel. So to hear that God is going to judge the enemies of Israel, and who are the threats to their existence, like Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites. It's very wonderful. But they also enjoyed it for another reason, because they believed in what is called the day of the Lord. And chapter 5 verse 8 says that, chapter 5 verse 18, in chapter 5 verse 18 says, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why should you have a day of the Lord? It's darkness and not light." Now what is this day of the Lord? Okay, first of all, remember that day of the Lord and the Lord's day are two different things. Lord's day comes only in the New Testament, only once, if I remember correctly. Day of the Lord, that they thought, there is a day called a day of the Lord when the Lord will vindicate Israel. By Israel I mean Judah and the northern kingdom, the 12 tribes. The kingdoms of the 12 tribes, the people of God. That is, God will punish the enemies of Israel. They will be destroyed on this day called the day of the Lord. And Israel will have a time of peace and prosperities. Some people Jewish writers went on to explain that on the day of the Lord, every vine will have 1,000 branches, and every branch will have 1,000 clusters of grapes, and every cluster will have 1,000 grapes in each cluster. So that is the prosperity that is going to have Israel, the people of God will have on the day of the Lord. All their enemies will be completely, utterly destroyed. But Prophet Amos turns the whole thing upside down in 5:18. But before he reached 5:18, in chapters 1:3, verse 3 to 2:16, the people expected, this great man is preaching about the destruction of our enemies, and we are going to have peace and prosperity soon. And even the people of Samaria who heard him might have clapped their hands when they heard the rival state in the south, that is Judah, will also be destroyed or will be judged according to God, by God. They might have clapped their hands then. Oh wow, the seventh nation. And they might have thought Amos will stop there. But Amos did not. He adds an eighth enemy of God who deserves the punishment from God. And though he did not detail all the sins of the other 7 nations, here he has a full list of their sin, transgressions, which deserves God's punishment. So, what is he doing here? He is saying that you are also included with other nations. You don't have any special privileges. We will see that later. Now you go through this list of the sins that are mentioned there. In the case of the 6 foreign nations, what I mean by foreign nations are nations or pagan nations, nations that who do not know the Lord, or who did not have a Torah, a covenant with God, like Judah and Israel had. These pagan countries will be judged for many things, for human violation of human rights. You go through that. And they had been selling people, the prisoners of war, or people caught in the wars. So human trafficking, horrible sins like violent sins like ripping open pregnant women when they captured some countries, and war crimes in general. These are the sins that these nations committed. These war crimes, denial of human rights, violence against women and helpless people, denial of rights, human trafficking, God is not going to forgive that. Why? Because as we read in Romans chapter 1 verses 18 onwards, or again in Romans 2, God has revealed what is right, His righteousness, His righteous expectations to everyone, whether they have the law or not, whether they are Jews or not. Paul has made it very clear, and this is called the general revelation. All that we need to know about God and God's righteousness are revealed. The glory of God is revealed in the nature, and the right and wrong is God has given that light in our conscience, human conscience. Here is the violation of human conscience. God is going to judge them for that. But when He comes to the seventh nation, Judah, and when He comes to the eighth nation, Israel, northern Israel, it is not only human right violation or violation of the general revelation that matters, but they have, in addition, they have violated the covenant of the Lord, the word of the Lord. They did not live. So that is the difference between 6 oracles, 1 to 6 numbers, 1 to 6, and 7 and 8. 7 and 8 also talks about that you are responsible as my people for the violation of my covenant with you. So two things are important. We have to note two things here. One, God is a righteous judge, not only over Judah and northern Israel, who are His people, who have received His laws. He will bring to account the whole world. That's a powerful message, the very, very powerful message of Amos. Amos says that God is not turning blind eye or deaf ears to what is going on in your world. The world where there is slavery, human trafficking, adultery, violence, denial of rights, war crimes, and whatever you can think of. Now, in some cases, in some of these prophecies, they say they made lime out of the people whom they massacred. They burnt their bones to make lime out of it, probably to whitewash their houses. But such a cruelty. But this helps us to understand our world. The book of Amos, these chapters. God is not blind. When people are trafficked, children are denied their rights, women and orphans are persecuted, when people have to migrate from their secure places, from their villages, leaving everything behind, because a mob or a riot against them, violence against them, has forced them out of their villages and they have become migrants, or war in their countries brought famine, or they have to travel through small boats risking their lives in the deep seas to reach the shores of Europe as illegal immigrants. God is not blind. God has seen all that, and He will act. And the people of God, I would say the Christians, those who know God, have even greater responsibility, because all that He wants for us, or He demands from a just society, is given in the Word of God. They have to live according to that law, what He has detailed in the written Word as well. So here is the message of Prophet Amos. Only one part of it that I saw today, or I was able to describe today. That is, God is a roaring lion. The lion will be in its pride for a long time, quiet, but from the cliff he can see all that is happening in the valley. You might have seen the film Lion King. From that rock high above, he can see all the animals, everything that is happening in the ravines and the valleys down there. And he is acting. He is going to act. That is the overture, overture, I would say, of the prophecies. That is, Israel, you should not just expect that because you are God's people, that all your enemies will be destroyed. God will destroy everyone who is against them. It doesn't matter whether you have a law, whether you have a temple, whether you pay lip service to God. And the next part of this, after including Israel with the nations who does not obey God, the rest of the prophecy, beginning with chapter 1 verse 1, we have only discussed the first 2 chapters. So the remaining part of the prophecy elaborates. There is no mention of any nations after this. Elaborates on the enormous responsibility that the people of God has, especially Northern Israel has, and the judgment of God upon them. That we will discuss next class. Until then, I should say that we should wind up now with chapters 1 and 2, and 3 to 6 we will discuss, or 3 to 9, the end of the book, we'll discuss in another session or sessions. And may God bless you.